Hello, history students. Today we're going to talk about the Vietnam War. And this is going to be a fairly basic kind of overview. The main things that I want to make sure that you know is why the United States was involved in Vietnam and kind of what the outcome was and the impact this had on American culture. Um, and so, you can see here on the PowerPoint where I have the years. You're talking about a very long war in Vietnam. Not all those years the United States was heavily involved, but the war itself went on from about 1955 to 1975, and then it was as far as the United States being heavily involved. We were involved in the 50s, being heavily involved from 1963 to 1973. So 20 years total and 10 years with pretty heavy American involvement in Vietnam. So the big question is, why is the United States involved in the war? And if you go back to a couple chapters ago, what we talked about in this class was, if you think about the Korean War, why was the United States involved in Korea? It was the simple answer is to contain communism, right? The whole idea of the containment policy. We firmly believe that communism had a mission to spread and conquer and put more and more people under this communist system. We believed that because that's what communist doctrine teaches, and that is exactly what communist governments like the Soviet Union did by taking over Eastern Europe and spreading revolution in places like China and Mongolia and Korea and eventually Cuba. We believed that communism was spreading, and we wanted to do everything we could to contain communism. For the most part, it worked pretty well in Korea. We stopped South Korea from becoming communist, and you can see the vast difference between a totalitarian communist regime in the north and a democratic regime in the south. And the United States played a role in that. And so Vietnam begins kind of in a similar way, but it's not the only thing that's going on. So let's go through this PowerPoint and let's talk about kind of the uniqueness of Vietnam. Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, you guys need to know the person Ho Chi Minh. There's his name there on the screen. You need to know him. This is kind of a joke. It has Ho Chi Minh and it says ho 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 Merry Christmas. He's got him dressed up for Christmas, which is, there's a bit of irony there since he was an atheist and killed many Catholics under his regime. But Ho Chi Minh, there's a few things to know about him. Ho Chi Minh was educated in Europe, and he became a communist in studying in France. He was the leader, first of all, and this is pretty important to note as you take notes on this. He's the leader, first of all, of a revolution against France. Ho Chi Minh is in a lot of ways kind of the founder. He's the George Washington, and I kind of hate this analogy because, he's no George Washington, but he, in a sense, he's the George Washington of the Vietnamese because they were a French colony for years. And this goes back for like 100 years that they had been controlled by the French, that their wealth was really extracted by the French Empire. But at the end of World War II, all over the world, there are independence movements, and Vietnam is no exception. There's this massive movement of decolonization after World War II. Countries that had been, these Western European countries that had big empires, like the British Empire, they lose India. The Dutch, they lose Indonesia, and the French are now losing Vietnam. And who's leading that in Vietnam? It's Ho Chi Minh that's uniting the Vietnamese people to fight against the French. Okay, so he's a politician. He has a huge following. I want you to see that it's not just as simple as It's communist versus capitalist, or Ho Chi Minh's communist. Yes, that is true, but he is also leading an independence movement. So the Vietnam War begins as the Vietnamese fighting for their own freedom against the French, which is a fairly noble cause that we would otherwise have supported if it weren't for the fact that he's communist. And we did not want Vietnam to fight for their freedom and go to communism. We believed in what is known as the domino theory. And I want you to know the domino theory. The domino theory goes back probably more to Eisenhower and then Kennedy. And then it continues to President Johnson. But the idea behind the domino theory is that when one country would fall to communism, another country would fall, and it would be like dominoes, doom, doom, doom. There's a lot of truth to this. It's what happened in Eastern Europe. Like I said before, communism really was spreading, and so we believed that this area of Southeast Asia that was fairly under the control of the French. We believe that area, if Vietnam were to become communist, the whole area would be in jeopardy of falling to communism. And indeed, at the very end of the Vietnam War, by the time it ends, Vietnam does become totally communist, as does Cambodia. So there is a little bit of reality that the domino theory really was the case. So we had to contain communism. That's what we felt our mission in the world was. Our duty during this time of the Cold War was to contain communism. Okay, another term that you need to know. You need to know the term Viet Cong. So Vietnam is it's a little bit confusing at times. So what you have in this independence war from the French is that you have a communist North Vietnam and we'll talk about this more, but a more capitalist, democratic, not too democratic, but not communist South Vietnam. Okay, and so you have very much like Korea, you have communists in the North, non-communists in the South. But inside South Vietnam, you also have these guerrilla kind of terrorist fighters that are the Viet Cong that are communists. So in your notes, write communist by the Viet Cong, but they are in South Vietnam. So South Vietnam is not supposed to be communist, but you had this group of people that are subversive, that are trying to take down the non-communist government of South Vietnam. So the Vietnam War gets very messy because, yes, the United States comes in eventually and fights against troops in North Vietnam, and we fight alongside the South Vietnamese. But at the same time, in South Vietnam, we're also fighting against the Viet Cong. So there's both going on, and it is messy, to say the least. South Vietnam was ruled by the president named Diem. Oh man, I forgot his first name. Here, just bear with me. Here, we're gonna type in. I don't know how to pronounce that anyway. Yo Nhong. I don't know anything about Vietnamese, so there you go. His name Ngo Diem. The United States had originally supported him, and supported him for a good while. But in 1963, and this was when Kennedy was still alive, Diem is kicked out. And we actually support a coup to get rid of this guy because Diem was he was supposedly on our side, but he was pretty tyrannical himself, and he wasn't democratic himself. So we were trying to support democracy. So we actually get rid of their government and try to put in a different government that we can support better to fight against the North Vietnamese. But at the time still, there are some troops in Vietnam. There are what is called advisors to the South Vietnamese to fight against the North Vietnamese, but we are not fully engaged in war in Vietnam. were just more very much involved in what's going on in Vietnam. This turns, and this is probably of all the kind of concepts to know, this is probably your most important. This turns with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, or the Tonkin Gulf Incident. This is also in 1963, where American ships were targeted in the Tonkin Gulf, and there's a lot of mystery as to what actually went on, but we felt that we were under attack. The Tonkin Gulf is the Gulf right around Vietnam, and we believed that our our Navy was attacked in the Tonkin Gulf, and it leads Congress to pass what they call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which basically allows President Johnson to do whatever he wants to in Vietnam, send troops, and I want you to note this: we do not declare war. We pass a resolution that allows the president to send a bunch of troops there. I mean, we wind up sending thousands and thousands of troops, and I think around 60,000 American troops die in this, and we don't declare war that Congress is supposed to do. We let the Congress tell the president to kind of send troops. So it really does fall on Johnson, President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, that he is the guy that really kind of takes the rap for so much of what happened in Vietnam. And maybe it's deserved, but Congress also didn't really do their job. They're the ones that are supposed to be declaring war. But this begins the phase of the Americanization of the war, which means the United States really takes over the heavy lifting in the fighting. The South Vietnamese are still fighting against the North Vietnamese, but we're coming alongside, and we are, it's our troops and our weapons and our technology that is trying to win this war. Okay, so North Vietnam communists, South Vietnam supported by the United States, with now a bunch of American troops in there fighting against the North. I'm not going to get into battles, and you're going to read some in the textbook and other things that are going to talk about, like napalm and Agent Orange, some of the kind of chemical weapons and things that were used in this. The war is pretty gruesome and devastating. Now, we're not really going to get into that, but right now, just to kind of understand that after the Tonkin Gulf incident, United States American troops are being sent over in mass to Vietnam to get rid of communism in Vietnam. And so there's this effort for the communists to take over the democratic people of the North, and we are there. Democratic people of the South, and we are there supporting South Vietnam. Okay, Vietnam War is not terribly popular. Reasons for this: one is it lasts for a long time. The longer it lasts, the less popular it becomes. The more people begin to question why we are there. The whole idea of containing communism becomes less and less a priority to people. Is it worth it if we are drafting our troops and our young people and sending them to die in Vietnam? Is that really worth what we're doing? And so in society in the 60s is just in tons of change. We're going to talk about this more, but this is the term I have up there, the counterculture. This is the time of the hippie movement. It is the time where there's this segment of society that is anti-establishment. We talked about this with like Bob Dylan and even like the civil rights movement. You have protesters protesting the way things had been done when it came to segregation. People continue that kind of countercultural, anti-establishment mentality, and it really runs throughout a lot of the youth culture of the 1960s. And so people divide into two camps a lot of times, between hawks, which are pro-war people, and doves. So hawks are the ones who think, oh, we need to contain communism. Communism's terrible. We need to do whatever we can do in Vietnam. And then doves that are saying, we should just be at peace. Why are we trying to mess with what's going on in another country? And they, tend to see America as an aggressive empire, whereas the other group of people tend to see America as freedom fighters, trying to liberate people from communism. Um, I remember reading an interview. This is slightly off topic, but I remember reading an interview with George Lucas. And George Lucas made the first Star Wars movie in the 1970s, um, shortly after we were out of Vietnam. It was written, I think, while we were still in Vietnam. And I didn't know this. You know, I grew up watching Star Wars. I love Star Wars. But he made it with this evil empire, if you guys remember Star Wars, this evil empire, and these people fighting against this evil empire. Um, he made that whole that series and the whole idea of the empire to reflect the United States and us, you know, fighting against the Vietnamese, us trying to keep them from being free. That's how he saw, at least in the 1970s, that's how he saw American activity in Vietnam, of us being the good guy, the Vietnamese being the bad guys. Um, I'm sorry, us being the bad guys and the Vietnamese being the good guys. Sorry, I totally mixed that up. So America is the empire, and the Vietnamese are the communist Vietnamese are the rebels. That's just a great example of the kind of hippie counterculture perspective, which was very different than kind of the establishment had been. So, oh, let me see here. These pictures, since doing this, I don't really have the ability to, the way I'm doing it, to make things come in and out. But here's a picture that says Johnson is a war criminal, no destruction in Vietnam. So it's a group of hippie protesters. There's, you know, songs and chants like, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The classic of people protesting the draft, you know, hell no, we won't go. You know, you know, clearly there was a lot of disagreement with Vietnam. We're going to get back to this picture, which is just awful, in a second. So we send troops down there, and for about 5 years, we are fighting against the North Vietnamese communists, and things don't go terribly well. Now, we had atomic weapons, but we didn't want to start World War III, which we thought, okay, the Soviet Union, China might, you know, their communist allies may get involved, so we don't want to get involved with that. We don't want World War III to happen, so we did kind of not go all out in our fighting, but we still sent troops and troops and troops. And in 1968, there's an event called the Tet Offensive, which it's on a Vietnamese holiday. That's what the word Tet means. It's I think, Vietnamese New Year, where it is an offensive by North Vietnam, by the communists against, and the Viet Cong teaming up together against the Southern Vietnamese, and it is a massive victory, and it really shows us that we're not winning this war. The U.S. Army is there, and you know it's remarkable. We've won. We beat Nazi Germany. We beat Japan. We won in Korea, but we're not winning this war. And it's not that we couldn't have won the war, but do we want to do what it takes to win the war? And it's, you know, that's a question that's just kind of floating out there at this time. You know, there are events, and this line here is, I have the My Lai massacre. That's what this picture is of. There are instances like this to where there were instances of American troops being involved in thinking that they're attacking the Vietnam, winding up killing civilians. The press gets a hold of that, and the newspapers are reporting, you know, about what's going on in Vietnam, and a lot of them are showing us losing, us committing some pretty heinous actions there, sometimes against civilians, you know, us bombing and using, you know, napalm on just burning down villages and things like that. And the press is reporting back in the United States, we're not winning the war, and we're doing awful, awful things in the war. So the Vietnam War gets very kind of hotly political, and there's a lot of just anxiety and who to trust in the press. It sounds very much like our time, and there's a lot of this going on during Vietnam, and it just becomes less and less popular. The longer it goes on, the more it's perceived that we're not winning, the more it's perceived that we're not even doing good there. The growth of the counterculture movement, it's not going well. Now, we're going to get to the election of 1968 and talk about it at the end of this. And we'll go back to kind of politics as a whole and not just Vietnam. But 1968 was a massive election, and I'll just skip what went on to know that Nixon winds up winning. Richard Nixon, who was married in Mission Inn at Riverside, California. That same Richard Nixon. Nixon begins the phase of what is known as the Vietnamization of the war, trying to hand the war back over to South Vietnam and American troops getting out. Now, it doesn't just happen overnight. He inherits this problem, and Nixon also, there are activities done by the Nixon administration, like we bomb Cambodia, and it's basically done in secret. Because Cambodia was a kind of way that troops went down from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. They would come around into Cambodia, and we wind up bombing areas in Cambodia. So certainly the Nixon administration didn't just do everything perfectly in Vietnam. But eventually we do. The war is so unpopular. In 1973, we make a peace treaty with the North Vietnamese. And it's a peace treaty between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And the United States agrees to our troops to leave. This is when Nixon was president. Our troops leave, and there is peace between North and South Vietnam. I have peace in quotation marks because it wasn't really the case. This was the same time as the Watergate incident. Nixon is forced to resign. We'll talk about that later, but Nixon is forced to resign. The only president ever that's forced to resign. He resigns. Gerald Ford becomes president. No one wants to get back involved in Vietnam, and North Vietnam bombs South Vietnam and takes over South Vietnam, and they rename the capital city of Saigon. They renamed Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City, which is what it is today, after Ho Chi Minh. And ultimately, what was our objective there? To contain communism and to help the South Vietnamese against the North Communist. And ultimately, the Northern Communists win. And it's at least the basics of the Vietnam War. You guys can't even read that, I don't think. I'm not gonna do that one. This says the election of 1968. There we go. The election of 1968. I find this to be a pretty fascinating event in American history. It just kind of shows you a lot about the 60s, about the volatility of the era, with so much going on. Civil rights going on at the same time, the civil rights movement at the same time as the Vietnam War. Things like assassinations. So here's what we have. President Johnson. President Johnson chooses not to run. Remember, he only had served one and part of another term because he took over when Kennedy was assassinated. So Johnson chooses not to run because his presidency, particularly because of Vietnam, was not very popular. And so John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, who had been Attorney General as well, Bobby Kennedy runs for the Democratic nomination. He is probably the front runner. He's a Kennedy. People loved his brother. He's pretty charismatic and handsome as well. Bobby Kennedy tries to get the Democratic Party nomination, and he is a Dove candidate. Remember, Johnson got us into the war, and so the Democratic Party was kind of split between the Hawks and the Doves. And Kennedy is definitely one of these guys that said we should have never gotten in there. We need to get out of there. This is still before the war's over. It's in '68, and Bobby Kennedy is the dove candidate, but probably going to be the Democratic nominee. Kennedy's assassinated. Kennedy apparently is assassinated by a guy who is a Arab Muslim because Kennedy seemed supportive of Israel and gets assassinated, which makes things crazy. Another guy that was running that eventually becomes the Democratic nominee is Humphrey. He was Johnson's vice president. Not a very very strong candidate, and what you have in the South is another candidate rising up, George Wallace. We've talked about George Wallace. You read about him or watched him in the video. He's the one who famously said, the famous speech, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And I said tomorrow because that's how he said it. Wallace was the governor of Alabama, who now runs for president. And if you can see from that map on the bottom there, Wallace wins the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana. He wins a lot of the South on a segregation ticket that basically, he, as the president, is going to fight for segregation. When it came to Vietnam, Wallace was saying, we're just going to nuke the North Vietnamese, Might even have World War III, but we're going to do what we need to do to win that war there. So Wallace was this really extreme candidate in a lot of ways, but he actually wins some states. And he makes it possible to kind of divide the Democratic Party and for Nixon to, between the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and George Wallace and everything else going on there, Nixon becomes the president of the United States on sort of like, let's restore law and order. There's lots of race rioting and things like that. We'll get to Nixon, talk about him more. I don't want to waste any more of your time. But it's ultimately Nixon, who's a Republican, who has his own problems as president, which are many. But it's Nixon who is the one who pulls the troops out of Vietnam. And just this election in 1968 was just a mess. And just, looking back at this era, and I know I started off talking about this, but, we got the Vietnam War and all the people that died in that, but we also have, Bobby Kennedy dying. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And, 5 years before that, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Somewhere in that range, I think it's before Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X is also assassinated. So it's just such a volatile time for these major figures in American political life, especially. Okay, so there's the basics, right? We're trying to contain communism, and we're going there to fight the North Vietnamese, and things don't go well. There's a lot of opposition. And you need to know Ho Chi Minh. You need to know President Johnson escalating troops, and after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And eventually, after '68, Nixon becomes president and eventually gets troops out of there, only to see South Vietnam fall to communism. Okay, there's the basics. We'll study this more with reading and with some other videos. God bless.